New York itself was the scene of a lot of racial violence during the decade. The city saw 3 high-profile mob cases no different than lynchings. In 1982, MTA maintenance man Willie Turks was dragged from his car and beaten to death near Sheepshead Bay, Brooklyn, and his 2 co-workers barely escaped with their lives. The perpetrators were over a dozen white men in their teens and early 20s. The ringleader, an 18-year-old weightlifter named Gino Bova, was convicted of second-degree murder by a jury of 11 white people and 1 Latino. The judge at his sentencing remarked, "It was a lynch mob on Avenue X that night. The only thing missing was a rope and a tree," before giving Bova the maximum 5 to 15-year sentence, of which he served 8. In Queens, New York in 1986, 23-year-old Trinidadian construction worker Michael Griffith and his friends traveled from Brooklyn to Howard Beach to pick up paychecks. Their car broke down. Walking roughly 3 miles to find a payphone and some food, they were met by a pack of over a dozen teenage and young adult racists. Michael was chased by a mob of white teens who beat him and his friends with baseball bats and tire irons. Fleeing from the mob onto the nearby highway, Michael was fatally hit by a car. The 17-year-old British teen who led the mob, John Lester, was convicted of second-degree murder and given 10 to 30 years, ultimately serving 13. 2 others were convicted and served 10 to 14 years apiece. The driver, who was alleged to be connected to the mob but the son of a cop, was cleared of any wrongdoing. Just 3 years later, another mob of white teens would murder a black person, this time much more directly. Yusuf Hawkins was 16 years old when he and his brother and 2 friends went to the largely Italian-American Brooklyn neighborhood of Bensonhurst. Bensonhurst was filled with recent immigrants, many from Sicily and southern Italy. Yusuf and friends were there to check out a $900 1982 Pontiac they saw listed in the classifieds. Little did Hawkins and his friends know that a mob of white teens were laying in wait to attack black men that were rumored to be attending a white girl's birthday party that night. Yusuf was beaten to death, and one of his friends who had also been beaten was detained by police for several hours without medical attention. Wrote Garrett McGrath, 3 days after Yusuf Hawkins' death, 300 black demonstrators marched through the streets of Bensonhurst. Neighborhood residents cursed and spat upon the protesters, hitting them with food. Some locals held watermelons.
In the aftermath of the killing, racial tensions in Bensonhurst and New York City have mounted. Local marches organized by civil rights groups have drawn anger from the community.
Why should the whole community be indicted and maligned and called racist for the acts of one individual? These people are good people. This is a good community, and there are not racists in this community.
This is not racist community. We just don't like black people. That's all.
My son will never turn this corner again.
No, he won't.
Only because of this, the pigment of his skin. Do you understand that? This is what America must learn. That we are no longer going to take this.
Multiple murderers of Yusuf were arrested and jailed lightly, with only 2 receiving hard time, leading to protests in the early 90s. Murders like these were just a reminder to those wrapped up in a Cosby Show fantasy of what the black experience meant in America. These 3 high-profile cases were in New York, a step away from Cosby's Brooklyn, and not in the Confederate-loving South, which was seeing a reverse migration trend of 355,000 new black residents from 1985 through 1989 in Atlanta, Virginia Beach, and Charlotte. When the subway vigilante Bernhard Goetz shot 4 young black men on a New York subway train in 1984, there were 3 main groups of people debating the issue. There were those who believed the 4 men's version, that the 18 to 19-year-olds were panhandling and that a racist white man had shot them. There were others who believed Goetz's version, that the men, 3 of whom had prior criminal convictions, were part of a growing crime culture of theft and assault, and had tried to rob Goetz. That camp was split between those who thought Goetz overreacted when he used his unlicensed gun,
and him taking a vigilante type response to crime in the city leads other people to feel that they can do it too. It can be harmful to all of us.
and those who thought Goetz was justified in the shooting.
I think he was, protecting himself. This is around the Christmas holiday. You gotta look out for yourself.
I think he did right. I really do. Because somebody's got to do something, and the police aren't always there.
What do you think about the fact that he's come back to New York? Do you feel he's coming back as a criminal?
I think he's a good man. I think he's a good man. He wants to show the public, look, I did it, and I'll pay the price, but I had to defend my life at that instance, in that moment.
He's certainly, violated some rules and regulations, but at the same time, I have a feeling, he did something right.
Goetz was just one of several people who took matters into their own hands, but his was the most high profile.
Angry and hopeless, some citizens have taken the law into their own hands. a vigilante backlash against crime.
Okay, let's get it up!
In Miami, crack houses have become the targets of arsonists. Recently, 4 suspected crack parlors were destroyed within a 10-hour period. Earlier this month in New York City, several people were arrested for beating a purse snatcher to death. They say their neighborhood has been plagued by a series of drug-related crimes. In Detroit, 2 men were charged with arson after they burned down this house. Butch Parisi and his neighbor, Perry Kent, say they took drastic measures to get rid of a nest of crack dealers.
A New York volunteer patrol group, largely made up of Black and Latino teens called the Guardian Angels, collected money towards Goetz's legal defense fund. The Guardian Angels had been founded in 1979 for the purpose of self-policing the city's subway systems in the face of rising assaults and robberies. An ongoing problem since the 70s was chain snatching, with one 1986 article describing a 37-year-old Bronx man who was dragged to death by a car when he tried to get his chain back from thieves. This was just one of several fatalities, and the fear of having your chain snatched would become a regional joke.
A jury of your peers has found you guilty of chain snatching. I sentence you to death by electric chair.
Boy, I should beat the links over you. You better take him to the chair.
Objections to these kinds of crimes created support for Bernhard Goetz, who was eventually cleared of major charges and only served 8 months for illegal weapons possession. Roy Ennis, the director of the Congress of Racial Equality, had lost 2 of his sons to gun violence, and the group threw its support behind Goetz and the right of private citizens to carry a concealed weapon. The Reverend Al Sharpton and others called Goetz a racist. It was revealed in 1985 by one of the 4 men, Daryl Caby, that the group had intended to rob Goetz. Another, James Ramsey, would end up in prison for raping a pregnant woman in 1986. Another, Barry Allen, ended up robbing a 58-year-old a few years later. The intra-community disagreement over whether Goetz was racist and how the 4 would-be robbers should have been treated would continue in other arguments about how to handle crime in the Black community.
Boston Celtics select Len Bias of the University of Maryland. There he is, Len Bias.
In 1986, Maryland native Len Bias seemed to be on top of the world. The 22-year-old University of Maryland basketball player was being compared to Michael Jordan, and it collected his second ACC Player of the Year award. On June 17th, he was selected by the Boston Celtics as the 2nd overall pick in the NBA draft. He was already in negotiations to accept a $1.6 million endorsement deal with Reebok.
What do you think your potential is?
Well, I think I need to improve more on my ball handling and my all-around play, but I think vastly I need to improve on my ball handling and just keep working on my game.
Well, you said you wanted to play basketball, model clothes, and do some interior design, and you're going to have plenty of time to do that and probably plenty of money. And to find out more about that, let's go up to Red Auerbach now in Boston.
By Juneteenth, he would be dead of a cocaine overdose.
Please come as soon as you can. It's no joke. Okay, Washington Hall, apartment number 1103. You're giving him a mouthful off. You can hear it now. This is Len Bias. You have to get him back to life. There's no way he can die. Sir. Please come quick.
Bias died of cocaine intoxication, which interrupted the normal electrical activity of his brain, which controlled his heartbeat. This resulted in the sudden onset of seizures and cardiac arrest. His drug overdose, though high profile, was just one of many affecting the Black community in the 80s. Bias's parents were dealt another blow when in 1990, the second of their 4 children, Jay, was killed in a drive-by shooting. The grief of these parents would motivate them to participate in anti-drug and gun control policy discussions, symbolizing 2 major concerns for the Black community at large in the late 80s. Crack use was a raging problem nationwide, wrapped up in wealth inequality, unemployment, and refusal to treat drug addiction as a disease rather than a criminal act. Plus, other social issues made the lure of easy drug dealing money or cheap self-medicating alluring. Excellent books like Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow delve into the systemic way the crack epidemic was weaponized by politicians to jail the population, often at a profit. But there's more to the story.
Some local politicians are asking for federal military help.
The National Guard could bring in persons or military police in jeeps and patrol those areas where we know they're heavily fortified and insist that they turn in those guns.
The city has declared a crime emergency. It is planning to shift 450 officers from the wealthier districts where crime is low to the tougher sections where murders are high. As part of the shift, the police chief is expected to move some officers from desk jobs to street patrols 1 day a week.
It wasn't just white people pushing for the criminalization of drug pushers and users, and this was something that had been evolving for a few decades. In 1979, Ebony magazine had dedicated an issue to detailing black people's growing alarm at the harm being perpetuated by their own in their own communities, discussing the term black-on-black crime, which they predicted would be a big problem in the following decade if nothing was done. They listed the causes as hard drugs, an inadequate prison system, racism, TV, and movies, and a lack of morality. A number of cures were presented, including a return to religious morality and correcting economic justice, the latter put forth by Congressman John Conyers. Winston E. Moore, however, the chief of security for Chicago's housing projects and the first black warden of a Cook County jail, wrote a popular piece saying, "It is my conviction that we will never put an end to the mounting problem of black-on-black crime until we stop coddling the hoodlums." Not only are these criminals allowed to prey on their law-abiding brothers and sisters with virtual impunity, they have attained bona fide hero status among many young blacks. He called for severe crackdowns on drug pushers while pointing out that the fastest growing crime in the black community was rape, of which nothing was being done because of stereotypes about black women. And only 1 year later, in another editorial, he would blame black mothers for homosexuality, rape, and femicide. Atlanta's chief of police, George Napper, who was demanding community accountability, wrote, "On too many occasions, friends have told me that they have gone out of their way to say corrective words to a 9 or 10-year-old youngster, only to be cussed out. Further, when reporting the incident to the child's mother or father, more obscenities were forthcoming. Obviously, and unfortunately, the next time the youngster is involved in a similar situation, there will be tendency to call the police and have them deal with it. Too many of our kids that can be controlled in the neighborhood end up being treated or mistreated by the criminal justice system." This quote demonstrates that while many black Americans acknowledge the damage and violence of the American legal system, the growing disconnect from community and shared racial values in the face of rising crime made calling cops on each other a bit easier, especially if you had witnessed or been a victim of a crime. Numerous Ebony subscribers wrote into the magazine agreeing with Winston Moore's demands to stop coddling the hoodlums. Remember Charles Murray from the last episode? From Thomas Sowell to Winston Moore, Murray's 1984 assessment that welfare and soft crime approaches were the true causes of problems in the black community, rather than white supremacy and wealth inequality, were similarly being made by some in the black community. At the time, prison abolition, drug decriminalization, and other now familiar yet still divisive ideas were on the fringes and most often being promoted by two groups that moderate black Americans rejected and still reject as much as they did white supremacists: black radicals and white liberals. In the black community, drugs were equated with slavery and the KKK. For some, seen as the racial battle of the times. Said Jesse Jackson, "No one has the right to kill our children. I won't take it from the Klan with a rope. I won't take it from a neighbor with dope." Drug dealers, for many black people, were race traders. Modern notions of non-violent drug offenses were a foreign concept to the people of the 1980s who were undaunted with violence on a daily basis. For many, crime and drugs were glued together. It would be an extreme disservice to anyone watching this video on the black experience in the 1980s to not have a full and objective view at crime and black responses to it. For many black Americans living through the frequent violence and despair, the crack epidemic and the resulting crimes could not be shouldered by white supremacy and wealth inequality alone. Likewise, mass incarceration caused irreversible damage to the community, but its existence cannot be fully blamed on white supremacy alone. It's ahistorical to pretend that black people were passive participants in the creation of mass incarceration and that significant violent crimes, especially against women, just weren't happening or that they were overblown. In 1980, black people accounted for 44% of arrests for violent crimes and nearly 30% of arrests for property crimes, despite being only 12% of the population. Most of the crimes were intraracial against members of their own community because of proximity and the likelihood of police apathy for black victims. During the decade, 60 62% of all drug-related homicides involved black victims. Thousands died and thousands more were injured or maimed by direct or stray bullets. The Federal Bureau of Justice Statistics calculated, based on crime victimization rates from 1975 to 1984, the lifetime chances of being raped, robbed, or assaulted. They found that if things kept going the way they were, 83% of all Americans aged 12 and up would be victims of some sort of attempted or completed violent crime. There were nightly news reports of gang killings, robberies, and crack cocaine-related arrests. The public also zeroed in on crack babies and their mothers, which we'll come back to in episode 5. Numerous black authors and artists documented the raw grittiness of the streets of 1980s New York, Chicago, and LA. In LA alone, the number of annual gang-related homicides would rise from 212 in 1984 to 771 in 1991, the same year that the screenplay John Singleton wrote in the late 80s premiered to critical acclaim. Another important fact about gang violence in the 80s was the new prevalence of high-powered military-grade weapons, which came with the international drug connections.
The drug money has turned street gangs into small armies.
We have semi-automatic and full automatic machine guns.
But there is nothing traditional about the firepower now being used. This car was riddled 40 times in a gun battle. The weapons were AK-47s like this one, the favorite assault rifle of many of the world's armies.
More guns on the streets meant that non-drug-related disputes could and did escalate from simple disagreements to shots being fired. Other important violence to note is the rape and sexual assault of the era, which we have way less official numbers on because only roughly 3% of women reported such crimes and way less men. In retrospect, we know the general permissiveness of rape culture in the black community, like modern revelations about the rapist Bill Cosby, or the retrospective views of threats and stories of rape documented in numerous rap songs of the period. In Monster, the autobiography of a gang member, the bulk of the violence Sanyika Shakur, aka Kody Scott, discussed was black men attempting to kill each other and hurting civilians in the process in 1980s South Central LA. But women inside and outside of the gangs were raped with impunity, with certain sets like a group of Hoovers being known for gang rapes. Of course, rape or violence against women was not just a gang thing. More concretely, we know the homicide rate of black women hovered around 43% during the decade. As crime in black communities grew, so did black attempts at mitigating it, and this includes those asking for harsher punishments after all the violence they saw and experienced. They weren't brainwashed, they were scared. A 1982 essay in The Atlantic titled Broken Windows, the Police and Neighborhood Safety, written by 2 white professors, argued that police could reduce major crimes by focusing on little shit, like panhandling, loitering, graffiti, public urination, and other largely victimless public nuisances. The broken windows theory appealed to police chiefs and mayors across the country. Future mayoral hopefuls like prosecutor Rudy Giuliani would make this ideology a core part of their platforms. Plus, cleaning up crime attracted businesses, taxes, and jobs. This was the case in New York, where battling graffiti was the key symbolic problem. For fearful constituents who were terrorized by gun violence in conjunction with the rise of drugs, supporting broken window policies and harsh drug crackdowns would be a no-brainer. In Locking Up Our Own, Crime and Punishment in Black America, James Foreman Jr. detailed how black communities supported eventual mass incarceration. The same year that the Broken Windows article dropped, D.C. was set to vote on Initiative 9, which would legalize mandatory minimum sentencing, 6 years after D.C. had enacted the strictest gun control laws in the country. The initiative was supported by the NRA and opposed by, quote, major civil rights groups, civil liberties organizations, and a citizens coalition called Citizens for Sensible Sentencing. Even still, 73% of the city's voters, many of them in poor black neighborhoods, approved of Initiative 9, which gave 5 to 10 year minimum sentences for firearm crimes. In 1986, D.C. launched Operation Clean Sweep. The anti-drug initiative gave officers the power to, quote, clear corners, establish roadblocks, make undercover purchases, seize cars, and condemn apartments. The program, which largely targeted small-scale dealers and users rather than kingpins, had the support of black voters who were not thinking about the long-term limited voting, employment, education, and housing opportunities of those arrested. The Washington Afro newspaper voiced its support, calling drugs a threat to our race. In the first 18 months of the program, police made 46,000 arrests, or 1 for every 14 D.C. residents. Marion Barry, who as a city council member back in 1975 voted to decriminalize marijuana, said of Operation Clean Sweep, "If you are caught with half a gram of cocaine, we will take away your car. If you are caught with 1 marijuana joint, we want your car." Despite the seizing of cars of drug purchasers, DC's homicide rate exploded in 1988, prompting City Council member Nadine Winter to implore Reagan to declare a state of emergency and deploy the National Guard. In 1987, Los Angeles initiated Project Hammer, in which law enforcement led destructive raids and arrested black and brown people because they looked like gang members. And one weekend, 1,453 people were detained. By 1990, over 50,000 people had been arrested in raids, with more black men and women arrested than in any period since the Watts riots of 1965. Many were never charged with anything. In one neighborhood, wrote the LA Times, the police smashed furniture, punched holes in walls, destroyed family photos, ripped down cabinet doors, slashed sofas, shattered mirrors, hammered toilets to porcelain shards, doused clothing with bleach, and emptied refrigerators. Some officers left their own graffiti. LAPD rules, rolling 30s, die. What did this particular raid yield? Less than 6 ounces of marijuana and less than an ounce of cocaine. Some black people upset with the constant gang violence rejoiced at the raids, as long as they weren't one of the many innocent people swept up in the raids or police brutality. Others were conflicted or downright alarmed. Wrote ACLU lawyer Gary Williams, "I do not want to see the hammer fall if the tactics employed include the indiscriminate detention and railroaded arrest of black youngsters because they look like gang members or because they happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time." But dauntless media coverage of crime, which we'll take a look at later in episode 6, fused with real experiences of crime. In 1989, when 22-year-old crack dealer Richard Winrow became the first Californian and the second American sentenced to life in prison without a chance of parole, the man who slammed the gavel was a 79-year-old black judge named David W. Williams. Winrow told reporters, "I'm being used as a guinea pig for the war on drugs," said Assistant U.S. Attorney John Gordon at the time. "The poor schmuck just happened to be unlucky that he is the first one," referring to the new law Reagan had signed in 1988 that mandated mandatory minimum sentencing for crack and gave people convicted of crack possession 3 times life in prison without the possibility of parole. Congress had also increased sentence minimums in 1984 and 1986, never calling public hearings or getting expert testimony on proposed legislation. The 1988 law created a 100-to-1 sentencing disparity between powder and crack, the latter widely associated with and used by black people. Other war on drugs policies intensified, like a fresh infusion of cash for state and local police who militarize their forces, seize property, and assaulted with impunity. The voices of those who knew this wasn't going to end well were drowned out, like Kurt L. Schmoke. In LA, where crack wars between gangs was rampant, the regional director for the Community Gang Services, Charles Norman, said that only a renewed program of jobs and community-based recreation activities could persuade a majority of gang members to reform. He went on to say, "You can't just suppress people who don't have any hope. I welcome new law enforcement, but there have to be alternatives."
And night after night, there are bodies, as the gangs who control the drug trade fight over territory. Across the country, hundreds are killed or wounded every week in gang-related shootings. Many innocent people who just happen to get in the way.
I just want to know why, why my child? What was...
Her 15-year-old daughter was killed.
You tell me where I can go to live in peace and peace of mind, then I will go. But there's nowhere that's safe in the city of Los Angeles.
In 1983, a year before the Bernhard Goetz incident, only 2% of New York's felony complaints resulted in jailed offenders. Goetz himself had been robbed by 3 men in 1981. Daryl KB, who had admitted to his group's intentions to rob Goetz that night, had participated in the armed robbery of 3 men just 2 months before the infamous shooting. It's no wonder Goetz had support from some black New Yorkers. The people who agreed with Goetz's decision to draw his gun would be many of the same people desiring requiring a solution to crime through arrests and punishment into the 90s. But cases like the Central Park Five, a 1989 event in which 4 black teenagers and 1 Latino teen were coerced into confessing to a rape they did not commit and subsequently imprisoned, showed that the justice system was fundamentally flawed and often unreliable. And by 1990, there were 130 black police chiefs nationwide in DC, New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Detroit, Chicago, and Houston. In 1990 Atlanta, new police chief Eldrin Bell made his stance clear on drug dealers, saying, "Unless we arrest them, incarcerate them, and spit them back out with only their underwear, they beat the system." Of course, discourse about drugs and policing and what prisons should even do would continue into the 90s as the black middle class fled from urban areas to suburbs and the Sun Belt in droves. It was around this time that some black leaders were beginning to question harsh mandatory sentencing and the police raids sweeping their communities. Not loudly, but they were beginning to think about it. From harsh sentencing sprung new issues like the increase in drug dealers employing children who didn't get mandatory minimum sentencing. Families were ripped apart when people were sent to prison. Meanwhile, some leaders worried about the war on drugs strictly in financial terms. In New York, summarized Deborah Peterson Small, the increasing population in prison worked to the benefit of upstate politicians and to the detriment of New York City politicians because the resources, the dollars from the state, followed the prisoners up there, and it meant money that was leaving the community, not just people.